Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Henney with Project Q Atlanta. Welcome to another episode of Q Conversations, our Friday live chat about LGBTQ issues. And today we're exploring the changing demographics of Gwinnett County and how it's gone from a white Republican stronghold to a majority population that is making LGBTQ history. Joining me today are Gwinnett County School Board member Everton Blair, County Commissioner Ben Koo, and State Representative Sam Park. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for taking part today. Also joining us is Project Q's Mike Fleming, who is moderating the online chat, which is to the right of your screen. So if you have comments, you can drop those in there during the event. And if you have any questions for our panelists, you can put those in the Ask a Question feature, which is down at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those a little bit later. So with that, we'll just jump right in and get started. So first question is, all three of you are Democrats, which not too long ago in Gwinnett was noteworthy enough. But all three of you made history with your elections. Everton, you were the first person of color elected to the school board and became its first LGBTQ member when you later came out. Ben, you were the first Asian American and first openly LGBTQ person elected to the county commission. And Sam, you were the first gay man ever elected to the Georgia General Assembly. So can each of you sort of talk about what that means to you personally and in a broader sense, what that means for Gwinnett? Everton, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I have a little bit of an echo on mine. I'm not sure who that is from, if we can fix it, but okay. I can try to ignore it. So for me, I think I really wanted to make sure that I amplified student experience. And I think as a role model, it's just important for us to see people who identify like we do in positions of power. And that was the reason why I chose to come out publicly. And that's the reason why I'm really active in students' lives in Gwinnett County and why I think it has a huge impact on how they see themselves.
All right, thank you. Let's see, Ben, can you address that?
Sure. One of the things that inspired me was having Sam be in the legislature. So thank you, Sam, for laying the groundwork for us. But one of the things I've learned is just having that representation in government is really important. When we did our first Pride Month proclamation last year, the reasoning that we hadn't done one before is because nobody had asked. And I'm sure there were people on staff who would have loved that, but there was just never a commissioner to actually ask for that, which is kind of mind-boggling that, again, even if they're not LGBTQ themselves, they wouldn't even pause that forward to just, again, have a proclamation. And then we have the Black History Month, we've got an API month proclamation, and we have proclamations for pretty much everything. And so that was a glaring oversight. And it's been great to be there to, again, push on these questions, like just simple things as far as enhancing our non-discrimination ordinance to be comprehensive, to include, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression explicitly, even though legally it may have been covered under sex. And thankfully the Supreme Court ruled that. But just being able to be forward thinking and actually get that in before the court ruling says that we have to do it that way has been great.
So as the first openly gay man elected to the Georgia General Assembly, I feel it's a big honor because my story, my path is part of all those who came before me who broke barriers for me, including Carla Drenner, Keisha Waits, Simone Bell, and many others. One of the things I say, when I talk about kind of, making history, is that it's one thing to break that rainbow barrier, that rainbow ceiling. It's a whole nother matter to pave the way for others, which I think is far more important. I think myself, Everton, Ben, we all ran not just to make history, but because we cared about issues, right? And I think that's an important component of this, and that it demonstrates not only that LGBTQ individuals can thrive in these areas in which we were often excluded, but it also demonstrates, especially given that we were popularly elected, that the people whom we serve are ready for representation, regardless of our sexual orientation. And so I think that it's an indication that Georgia is ready to move forward, which gives me hope.
Well, in addition to the election of the three of you, earlier this year, Angela Duncan, a lesbian, was appointed to the Superior Court judgeship by the governor, and a Democrat who is LGBTQ ran last month in the Democratic primary for county commission chair. So, given all that, can you guys talk a little bit about how Gwinnett is changing?
Well, we're definitely diversifying. I think that one of the last spaces where you see that diversity is typically in the elected leaders, but we've had growing populations, both with respect to sexual identity, but also racial and ethnic identity. And it's just a really great thing to see those people take up the charge and run for office and win. So I think our political sphere right now is much more inclusive, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think, to Everton's point, we are diversifying, but the thing is, Gwinnett has been diversifying for over 30 years. And the whole issue around the Confederate monument in Lawrenceville, that wasn't even there in 1990. And so that diversification has been happening, but yet we still haven't seen it in government until recently. Sam's election, Brenda's election, and then our election in 2018. Marlene and I were the first people of color on the Board of Commissioners in the 200-year history, and so that's been amazing. And then again, we were the first Democrats in over 30 years. So it's been really good to have these conversations that aren't just, well, this is how we've always done it, and this is how we're going to do it, and we're not even going to consider potential additional technology or options or viewpoints. So it's been refreshing.
I think the speed at which we're seeing the electoral change occur in Gwinnett, it's still astounding to me to a certain degree. I know back in 2016 when I was first elected, I was the only Democrat who won. And then 2 years later, we flipped the entire delegation, make history with Everton and with Ben. And the opportunity in which all of the diverse communities now have an opportunity to run and serve and ensure that they have a seat at the table, I think serves to a certain degree as a model for the rest of the state. As Gwinnett has this opportunity to be a model in terms of what a diverse community looks like that thrives, right? That then becomes an opportunity or perhaps an example for the rest of the state as the state continues to diversify to follow suit. Again, expanding the electorate, which allows other communities to participate in our democracy, which I think is good on by and large.
What's the LGBTQ community like in Gwinnett? Of course, Atlanta has Midtown. That's kind of the longstanding symbolic home of the community in Atlanta. But is there that sense of community in Gwinnett?
There's not a gay bar in Gwinnett.
Not yet.
My experience canvassing my district, the past two election cycles, when I run into LGBTQ folks, they're families, right? They're young couples, who move out to the suburbs to start their own families. And I think, again, it's an opportunity in which folks feel safe. And that's a great thing about Gwinnett, in which regardless of, whom you love, you have a place to call home.
Yeah, I would say that canvassing, I was surprised to see some of the same people you would run into in the streets in Atlanta that just live in Gwinnett. And so there's a suburban dynamic where we just don't have the same hangout spots. Right. And so a lot of us still flock to the city for our safe spaces, especially recreationally. But we're everywhere, and we have been everywhere. And I think, the election of the three of us is a partial testament to just amplifying the fact that we've been here.
And I think we're gaining more safe spaces in Gwinnett. We are, Norcross had a Pride celebration last year, and it was very well attended. They packed the park there. So I think we're obviously here, and I think there are more areas where we're able to congregate and get together.
Sure. Okay. Well, and so does being the first LGBTQ person elected to your position bring challenges? And Everton, I'll ask you that first. You sometimes seem to be at odds, or maybe exasperated is a better way to put it, with other school board members. So is that because there's sort of a generational difference and you're, in addition to being the first LGBT person and person of color on the board, you're also quite a bit younger than your colleagues there, or is it a political thing, or what? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I don't know how to isolate which identity trait most of the time. I would say it's probably the confluence of all of those things. But yeah, it does make it a little difficult, but I stand firm in the people that I know support me. I'd say the biggest thing educationally is just figuring out how to speak to other people on the board's values for an issue that they have not conceived of because it does not directly impact them. And so when we think about inclusion, oftentimes I'll say, like, as a young gay kid, I didn't even feel comfortable enough saying that. And so now there are people in this county who at least have the amplification of who they are, and they have prison clubs or gay straight alliances. And it's a different experience when you at least have an affinity space. So we should protect those spaces because it allows kids to grow up healthier, happier, and more successful in school. And that should be what we all want. And when you speak to the outcomes in that way, it allows you to then say, and we need to do this thing, and we need to create this space or protect it so that it keeps to those outcomes. But it's hard because I still think we live in a society where a lot of people can't get outside of their own lived experience and empathize with somebody else's.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Sam, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, I was going to say, the three of us are all, is LGBTQ is one attribute, but we're also younger and not white. So we're not fully white, I should say, for some of us. But like I've noticed that it kind of comes in that order. Is the youth is the biggest differentiator, I think, and then race, and then the LGBTQ thing, I think, ends up being just icing on the cake.
Right. And Sam, what about you? So you're one of 5 LGBT members in the House. You're also in the minority party. So does that sort of impact your legislative agenda or how you can go about accomplishing things there?
Sure. So, I think it's always difficult serving in the minority party because you have no control over the legislative agenda. Oftentimes we have to be reactive. That said, one of the first things I was very intentional with when I was first elected was finding that common ground, which Everton referred to, demonstrating that, even though I may be of a different generation, of a different ethnic background, of a different sexual orientation, I still care about this state just as much as my older rural colleagues. And how I demonstrated that was by working hard, by preparing for committee hearings, by asking good questions. And in so doing, I think that builds trust and respect in which, if there are, the chairmen of my committees have been very respectful to me, always giving me an opportunity to ask questions. And of course, talking to other Republican members to help carry different legislative ideas or pieces that I very much care about. You have to work in a bipartisan fashion, one way or the other, in a legislative body. A perfect example of that, I think, would be the HIV decriminalization bill, in which there is bipartisan support, though, of course, that fell short in terms of making it all the way through the legislative process.
Okay. Ben, when you were elected in 2018, you talked about wanting to expand the county's non-discrimination ordinance by adding sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So I wanted to ask you, where does that stand?
Oh, so that actually did get approved, I think, last month. We finally voted on it. It sat around for a while going through process. One of the things I've learned is government moves much slower than than the private industry, so private sector. So it finally got through there. It was interestingly enough, a 3-2 vote, but it did pass, and it really is just a matter of clarity because, again, as we saw with the Supreme Court decision, those categories were already protected classes. It's just a matter of, taking a look. We had this language in 6 different places, and it was written 6 different ways. And so part of that effort was really just to get it uniform, consistent, and clear.
And so it added sexual orientation and gender?
Yes, explicitly calls out sexual orientation and gender, both expression and identity. And it actually relegates sex to its scientifically proper place as part of genetic information.
Okay,
as opposed to being the umbrella term for sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and pregnancy, oddly enough, apparently was covered under sex before.
Okay, well, great. I hadn't heard that. We hadn't reported, so we made a little news today. So that's awesome. Everton, what about you? Is there work to be done like that with school board policies?
Yes. We'll take it up in January.
Okay.
There's more I could say there.
In terms of like the non-discrimination ordinance or policy or in other places?
Yeah, just the resistance to wanting to do it now.
Okay.
But I think with the new board, we'll be able to add necessary words and characteristics to our non-discrimination policy.
Okay, great. So
I'm looking forward to a lot of good change in 2021.
So even with your elections and the change in demographics in Gwinnett, not everyone is a fan. So this week, a Republican county commission candidate questioned the value of diversity. It was in 2017 when County Commissioner Tommy Hunter disparaged Democrats and used racial slurs referring to U.S. Representative John Lewis. Any of you face backlash or negative feedback from Gwinnett residents?
Sure, I think that's part of change that people are going to be somewhat wary of. When I still vividly remember having the door slammed in my face many times as I was canvassing, often not because I'm Asian or gay, but because I say the word Democrat. Right? As soon as I say the D word, people kind of jump as if they're going to catch something. But all of that to say, I think, people, I think, will sometimes always be inherently scared of, changing demographics and things of that nature. And it is, I think, incumbent upon us to a certain degree to lean in, to try and ameliorate their fear. But at the same time, we also represent, the next generation and communities who have often been either oppressed or have been voiceless and ignored. And it's our obligation, I feel, to ensure that, again, we are there, that we remain present and visible, to demonstrate that, our communities, especially those such as the LGBT community, that we are here and we're not going anywhere.
Right. Yeah, I'd add that oftentimes I think we don't get the benefit of the doubt, or there's a dismissive nature to something that we say because we haven't had the same lived experience of somebody else who opposes it. And that's what's been hard for me. I don't know if I can reduce it to the fact that I'm gay against any of the other reasons, but I think most specifically, there are a lot of issues that parents feel very strongly about, and they cannot conceive of a single person being able to pass policy or understand an issue if they themselves do not have children. And that's been one area that I've really struggled with, and I found people to be a little bit dismissive.
And Everton, how have your constituents reacted? I think you came out after you were elected, and I don't think you faced voters again until 2022. So have you had any feedback from that or concerned about how that might go over?
No, overwhelmingly positive. And I mean, also people knew,
right?
But I just had never publicly written it down, put it out for the press to know.
Okay. Ben, what about with you?
Yeah, I think to Sam's point, people are, I think, just generally scared of change. I mean, most of us that get comfortable with certain ways of doing things, and the more we do it that way for more and more years, the harder it is to consider doing something different. And so, one of the things, obviously, my push as with a technology background is to really leverage some of these technologies and take advantage of the situation that COVID has actually given us, to be able to do more virtual things, reduce the traffic on the roads, and allow greater participation in the process by allowing people to interact virtually. It makes the government more accessible. So I think the way to combat that fear of change is to really improve our transparency so that people can be comfortable. Hey, I can participate. I can see what's going on. I don't have to worry that somebody's making some decision in the back room. If we have it all out in the open, it makes it much easier to have that change.
Okay. And what is it like to serve on the commission with Tommy Hunter? Has that been problematic? Have you all been able to find some common ground to work together on some issues?
It's been fine. We were nervous going into it, but we chats with Marlene all the time. He sits right next to her. It hasn't been an issue. We haven't made anything personal generally, and I think that's allowed us to work together, because those issues aside and that incident aside, the main thing we can all focus on is that we care about this county. We may have different ways of approaching problems, but if we talk about the issues and just talk about the attributes and the pros and cons and stuff like that, the personality stuff, the personal issues don't really come into it. So it's actually been all right working with Tom.
Okay. So I think all of you have touched on this a little bit. How do you sort of balance being the first LGBTQ person elected to your respective offices, and balance that, with sort of the responsibilities that comes with in Metro Atlanta's larger LGBT population, and balance that against serving your specific constituencies in Gwinnett? Who wants to take that one?
I can jump in on that.
That's more of a Sam question. Yeah.
well, kind of going back to my earlier point of leaning in to kind of drive out the fear. That goes back to one of the first lessons I learned when I first ran for office, which is that we have a lot more in common than that which divides us, right? And from the local level to the national level, the level of fear and division that exists in our politics is so much, to a certain degree, that it paralyzes the system, right? And I think as new leaders, we need to be very intentional with doing what we can to drive that out, to build trust, because that's how we ultimately will make progress, by building that trust, building coalitions, and moving forward together. A perfect example when it comes to serving both my constituents and my district, as well as the LGBTQ community, is healthcare, right? Of course, I initially ran for office, and it's still an issue that I passionately care about, particularly when it comes to the uninsured population in the state of Georgia, where, because of Republicans' failure to expand Medicaid, we have the third highest uninsured rate in the nation, right? That structural challenge, that deficit, is one of the primary drivers as to why we have an HIV/AIDS epidemic, which is an issue that I continue to work on in my private capacity as an attorney for a nonprofit health center. And so, that issue, I think, is a perfect example of how, LGBTQ issues aren't necessarily wholly distinct and separate from issues that we all care about, right? Especially in Georgia, where there's such a need for access to healthcare, particularly in the midst of this pandemic.
Right. Ben or Everton, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I mean, that's kind of what Sam was just saying. LGBTQ issues tend to be just human issues. Like, there's not a lot that's unique to us, other than the fact that we tend to be marginalized, just like many other communities tend to get marginalized. And so that's where everybody benefits from improved customer service, improved transparency. These are just common human values that we need to be taking into consideration. And by addressing those issues, the systemic problems, we benefit all communities, including the LGBTQ communities.
I'd also just add that the service centers tend to be concentrated in the city of Atlanta. And as the suburbs diversify, it's a lot harder for us to serve everybody without the same network and infrastructure in terms of reaching everyone. And so I know that when there are issues that either are gay parents or families or students are facing, it is just harder to even build the foundation in a larger county where we have not even started to address the issues that those students are facing in ways that is different in the city of Atlanta or in Fulton County, because they've had the nonprofit groups, the centers, and just the sense of urgency that we're just beginning to really expand.
Matt, if I could add one thing, in no way should we diminish the disparities that do exist in which, our communities, suffer more. But the hate crimes bill that passed is a good example of this, in which, of course, we know the community that is most often attacked are transgender women of color, right? But yet the hate crimes bill, one of the selling points for it to get Republicans on board was that it protects everyone, right? Particularly, if we're looking at sexual orientation. Yes, it provides protections for the LGBT community. It also provides protections for those for the straight community, right? Equal protections will help bring equity to the disparities that exist, and I think that's also important to note.
Okay. And so, for weeks, we've had protests all over Metro Atlanta for protests and marches for racial justice and police reform. Has that impacted your jobs in terms of your elected offices? Is that how has that kind of manifested itself in Gwinnett?
I can speak a lot to that.
Okay.
We have seen it show up tremendously with our educators. New groups have formed, new energy around just paying specific attention to our curriculum. When we talk about how to dismantle systemic racism, it does show up in our education system. And I would say that schools have the greatest possibility in order to address it so that it less so impacts future generations. And so I've been excited to see kind of a percolation of energy around issues that we've known to be challenging since the inception of this country. And it's just been interesting to see the response to those things that's a lot more inclusive. Even every school leader and the board and superintendent put together statements in resolution affirming Black lives. They did not say Black Lives Matter, but we take what we can get. And so I think it gave us real leverage to build some equitable practices that we're going to see in the fall. And I've been working with our folks to really understand what that looks like, how to make our social studies curriculum more inclusive, how to think about implicit bias and how that shows up for teachers, and just what we're doing to diversify our student and teacher population.
Okay. Ben or Sam, do you want to?
Sure. At the state level, I mean, I think without a doubt in my mind, the momentum of the Black Lives Matter movements helped push the hate crimes bill through. Because let's not forget that the House passed that last year, and it was simply sitting in the Senate Judiciary Committee for about a year and a half. But it wasn't until we saw this momentum, this demand for justice, that we finally saw progress when it came to that issue in which, Georgia for more than 16 years didn't have a hate crime statute on the books. All of that to say, I think it's also important to recognize that the hate crime statute will not, in and of itself, fix all the systemic challenges that we face. We have to continue our work in a bipartisan manner to the degree possible when it comes to criminal justice reform, as it occurred under the previous administration under Governor Deal. I was also very, very proud to pass a resolution in the Georgia House as a member of the minority party that recognizes Black Lives Matter, that systemic racism is real, and has present day and the present day realities of the systemic racism in which we face. Because ultimately, especially as a state in which we have a dark history and the shadow of legacy still casts that long shadow, or the sin of slavery, I should say, casts that long shadow, that we have to recognize the severity of the problem if we're ever going to fix the challenges that we face.
Okay.
And I guess I'll just follow up that this movement has been great because it frames, it gives context so that allows us to have certain discussions that were just completely ignored before. Now, at least that gives an opening, like, okay, well, we need to start talking about these things. So it helps to frame those discussions. It's also allowed me to kind of think of ways that we can reorganize the county, because most of, if you look at an organization, the way it's structured and organized, it says a lot about what the real values of the organization are. And when you look at it in that sense, you kind of get a picture of, well, what is it that's actually important to Gwinnett, and versus what do we want it to be important to Gwinnett? What are we just giving lip service to versus what needs to be something that permeates the organization from top to bottom, from everything from the organization all the way through to the messaging and the policies, and make sure that all that stuff is in line to really serve the people.
Okay. And what about the coronavirus pandemic? I know, Everton, you have been consumed, I think, with working and as the county makes its plans for students to return in a matter of weeks. So how has the pandemic impacted you guys?
Tremendously. I mean, I would love nothing else than for us to be able to return to normal and have students in person, but we can't. And we can't in part because of the failure of leadership above us, but we just don't even have a situation where people can get access to testing. And you can't put teachers around, hundreds of different students a day and not expect a cascade of chaos where there's going to be subsequent closures anyway because of incidences of exposure. And we just don't yet have the public health awareness and consensus to be able to say with confidence that we can bring kids into a school building, let alone social distancing provisions on buses and in cafeterias and in hallway transitions and things like that.
Okay. I think that's the hashtag for the day, cascade of chaos. That's pretty good. Sam or Ben, do you want to talk about the pandemic and how it's impacted you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think just incredibly concerning with the current situation in which we are in, where we're seeing a rise in cases, and let's be clear that we never actually ended that first initial wave. We simply plateaued, and now we are beginning to increase again in the number of new cases. And of course, after cases rise, we'll inevitably see an increase in hospitalizations, which we are seeing across the state, where ICU beds are being filled up. And then, of course, deaths shortly follow after that. I'm, again, incredibly concerned based on the lack of leadership that we've seen at both the state level and the national level. And based on what they've done so far, how are they going to respond with this growing crisis? So again, it's incredibly concerning with where we are, because of course, there's that false choice often made between staying safe or dealing with the pandemic and the economy. But you can't. People aren't going to go back to business as usual if there is a deadly virus with unknown unintended consequences that's still rapidly spreading to such a degree in which we don't even know the degree in which there is community spread out there. And so, I think, again, I'm incredibly concerned and quite frustrated with the actions our current leadership is taking.
Right.
Yeah, I come back to just looking at this graph. I mean, it's just looking at that exponential curve. We're at almost 300 new cases a day in Gwinnett County. And we really never did plateau even. Not dead does not mean not fine. Like it means everything good, because just because our deaths have been going down, which again are on a 14-day lag from these numbers, I mean, people who get this don't fully recover always. You know, there can be long-term damage that can be problematic and life scarring. So it is a very big concern and problem. And like Sam said, there's been a lack of testing that's also been problematic. And to that vein, my father, who's an MD PhD, came up with an idea to do some crowdsource data collection. And so we created a site, countcovid.org, that you can go and report your symptoms. And with that, we've been able to actually get data that matches the antibody testing that was done in New York for the same period. We did a short study, and it tracked great. So we're able to get the numbers of where the actual prevalence is and how many cases we have without relying on testing. And we actually get it in real time versus having that 14-day delay and lag time. So please do go to countcovid.org and track your symptoms. No, that's a shameless plug, but
thank you. Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions from our audience, so we'll get into those. We'll just stick with the COVID theme here. Gwinnett now has the highest number of new COVID cases per capita in the metro area, one of our audience members asked. So what can be done in your respective positions to stem the tide? And Everton, should schools open?
No, they can't. I don't mean to be flip, but we have to ask ourselves how many deaths we're comfortable with when we make those sorts of decisions. And if the answer is 0, which it should be, then we can't just continue with business as usual or with a laissez-faire approach to all or nothing. And even the minimum is above what we're currently doing. We were able to pass a mandated mask requirement for students, teachers, and all visitors in the building, but that was not without significant effort, and I'm still dealing with a lot of resistance on that. So I just don't see a world where we're able to feasibly and sustainably open schools, and I predict closures in the fall at the latest.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just really important to emphasize that what we are going through right now is not normal, right? And what we are experiencing is a failure in leadership. And you don't have to look too far to get a sense of how that is, right? If you look at other countries who have been successfully able to contain and control this virus, again, you know, the number of cases that the U.S. has, the number of deaths that we already have, and all of that still rapidly growing, again, is you know, we're not in a good spot, period. And in response to this challenging situation, you know, what did our Republican-led state legislature do? They passed legislation to protect all businesses and government entities from being sued if an employee or a customer gets the coronavirus, right? And so, you know, there is some dereliction of duty that is occurring in which folks simply, you know, either don't care or, given their concerns regarding their political fortunes, they're not willing to take strong actions. Either which way, you know, the status quo is unacceptable. Unfortunately, I think the only way in which we can have meaningful change is through a change in leadership this November. Which in the meantime, we have to do everything we can to take care of ourselves, because clearly our current elected officials, our governor, our president, they are advising, right? You know, we have the most powerful man in the world sitting in the White House doing nothing but trying to downplay the severity of this unprecedented pandemic. That's unacceptable. And if we continue on this current route, all we're going to see is more loss of life, a more damaged economy, and again, we're not moving in the right direction.
Okay. Here is another question. Let's see. Another question from our audience, and they were asking. They wanted to know they wanted to get your views on how members of the LGBTQ community can get closer. And they say, I don't share the same sentiment with my fellow female identified individuals and friends, but many of us don't feel comfortable with getting involved in the LGBTQ community because many things are run by male identified individuals. So any advice on that?
I would say rise up, lead on. I think there's a lot of opportunity to pioneer your own path, especially if there is an area or an issue that's not being adequately represented or being heard.
Yeah, I've got lots of boards and authority appointments to make. I would love to see more female LGBTQ representation on those boards. And the way I do it is an open process. So really the first step is just making sure you apply and take advantage of those opportunities when they come up. I just had an appointment that just came up last week, and I had that application open for 2 months and only got one applicant. So if you were an LGBTQ female and had applied, you probably would have gotten it. Your chances were very good. You had a 50-50 chance. So.
Okay. Everton, any thoughts on that? Just on how people get more involved?
I think we need to do a better job at listening. I mean, maybe just in general, creating space for women and female identifying members of the LGBTQ community to share a little bit with why, and then try to make it better. And I see a lot of parallels to how underrepresentation seems like the onus is on that underrepresented group to do something to dismantle the leadership structure. And then maybe in that same case, we can do a little bit better of a job at being intersectional and just finding out how to create more space.
Okay, thank you. And we touched on this one a little bit about the impact of being younger and what differences that has made in your roles, in your respective agencies or boards that you're involved with. So do you want to talk about that anymore, or any additional thoughts about that? What the difference being younger has meant?
It is definitely a different perspective. There's the way things used to be was very much, okay, we try and fail, and we figure out what works, and then that's what works, and we don't deviate from that. But the modern world is very different from that. It's not, we don't make this master plan and then move forward for the next 100 years. This kind of goes back to software design. The modern approach is really more of an iterative approach. You do something, you get the minimum viable product out there, you get something that's an improvement, you get something that works, and then you just keep improving it every year, every month, going forward. It's not just some grand plan, because we need to be able to adapt and evolve, and the world is changing so fast. If we make even a 5-year plan, by the time we've finished making the plan, because if it takes a year to make the plan, the parameters have already changed. So we have to be more adaptive, and that is something that's really hard for I think the older generations to really wrap their mind around and get comfortable with, because it does involve a lot of change and being comfortable with some level of failure. Apparently, I mean, you have to figure out where things are going to fail, but you have to do it in such a way where it's not devastating. It's just a minor mistake, and you've got to be able to learn and progress from that. You can't say we're not going to have any mistakes, because then everything is going to be a mistake.
Okay.
Just in terms of the generational divide, I've seen more innovation and change in the last year and a half since being on the board than probably in my lifetime. And I grew up in Gwinnett and graduated from the school district that I now represent. And even just like board orientation when I joined was a fax machine, a corded phone, and it just, everything we did was printed. A couple of the board members don't use email. It was tremendous how archaic some of our processes were. And I think a lot of that was just because people were just doing what they were used to, and the board hadn't changed in 20 some years. So now I think it's been hugely adaptive for us to just think about innovative things we can add. But then also, when I think all of us can relate to this, when such significant change happens so quickly, there's a learning curve for everybody, not just us who have to understand how patient we have to be in moving these really slow systems, but also them who are like, oh, wow, these young folks really want to come in and change stuff and are not used to having to wait. So I recognize that it's a give and take. And, it's been a little challenging because I'm like 30 years younger than the next youngest person. But it's, I have a lot of people behind me that understand what's going on and support what's going on in the county.
Yeah, I think, without a doubt, we need the next generation to rise up. We need the next generation to lead, because I think we're ultimately going to be the ones who are going to have to deal with the challenges that we face in the future, particularly with the ravages of climate change, with the acceleration of technology that's driving inequality, the rise of authoritarianism around the world. And we're seeing that already, right? I think in America, we've always seen the young lead change movements, whether it was the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the demand for gun safety. And those are all, I think, fantastic things. The one thing I would urge is for us to be smart, right? To hone the power that we wield so that translates into electoral power in which we have control over the levers of power. Because that's ultimately, I think, the way in which we can make permanent change going forward, in which we can continue to adapt with the challenges that we face going forward.
Thank you. And Ben, this might be a question for you, given your role with the County Commission, but what measures can be taken at the government level realistically to improve the voting process and fight against voter suppression? That's another question from one of our attendees.
Yeah, I was actually just talking to our Board of Registrations and Election today about some of that. We can make the process more transparent, clear, and accessible. There's obviously stuff we can do with the website. We can increase early voting times and opportunities. We can mail people their absentee ballots, hopefully. There's lots that we can do, and there's so much room for improvement. Even something as simple as moving the Board of Registration Elections meetings into the auditorium where they can be televised, live streamed, and recorded. That will allow more people to be engaged with the process and actually participate, as opposed to having it in a room that is only available to the people who show up. And that's part of the problem, is that so many decisions are made just by the people who show up, and most people don't even know that the meeting's taking place. And so that in and of itself is a form of voter suppression and lack of representation. So that really improving transparency, improving opportunities is really the way to go. We've had record turnout for these primaries when we mailed everybody their absentee ballots, and we showed that people are willing to vote if you make it a not painful process. And that's the thing, is so many of these things are designed just to make the process difficult. And that is a method of voter suppression, because the more barriers you put up to somebody, the less likely they're going to do it. And you can't keep making everybody jump through hoops in order to exercise their right to vote. And everybody has a right to vote, and that should be the easiest thing to do.
Okay, thanks, Ben. All right, so as we bring our Q&A to a close, I want to thank everyone for taking part. After the event, you'll get an email with a link for the replay if you want to rewatch it again or share it on social media, as well as a survey so we can get your feedback on how things went today and how we can improve future events. So a big thank you to Everton, Ben, and Sam for their time today. One last question to each of you. Where can people follow you or keep up with you or find out more information in terms of social media and that sort of thing? Sam?
So I'm on Twitter and Facebook, Sam for Georgia, all spelled out. And on Instagram, I'm Rep Sam Park.
How about you, Ben?
On Twitter, I'm at Ben Koo. On Instagram and Facebook, it's at Koo for You, Ku, FORYOU, all spelled out.
Okay. And I think we lost Everton, but he said in the chat, his social media is at Everton Blair, and we'll include all of that in our follow-up email to everyone so you can have that handy. So thank you. I appreciate everyone's time. Thanks again, and stay safe, wear your mask, and enjoy your weekend. Goodbye.